So let's get started. Welcome to Sejong's webinar. Good morning and good evening. I'm Sang-Hyun Lee, President of the Sejong Institute. I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar. And today's event will be live streamed on YouTube, and you can find its access address in Sejong's website. So today we will talk about Korea-US relations after South Korea's presidential election. As we all know, in the recent election, People Power Party, conservative candidate Yoon Suk-yeol won the victory over Lee Jae-myung, Liberal Party, but with quite a narrow margin. So perhaps new government's North Korea policy and general foreign policy stance will be somewhat different from that of Moon Jae-in administration. That's the point we would like to look into a little more detail in today's webinar. So perhaps you heard many stories and many analyses about the recent election. But now the party is over, and I think it's time to think about what kind of a implication does this election have on the future of Korea's foreign policy and North Korea policy, including Korea-US relations. So today's webinar, we invited 4 prominent experts from both US and South Korea. Dr. Jung Gu-yeon from 강원 National University, Dr. Sung Gi-young from Institute for National Security Strategy, Scott Snyder from Council on Foreign Relations, and Jenny Town, Stimson 38 North. Thank you for joining us today. So as an initial startup remark, I would like to invite all of you to talk roughly about 5 minutes about what's the general implication of this election? What's the election outcome tells about future Korea-US relations? So who will start? Lady first, Dr. Chung. How did you see this election, and what's your feeling about the future?
Well, I think this is a typical example of retrospective voting for South Korea. And as you mentioned, South Koreans voted for candidate Yoon not because they fully agree with his policies and his personality, but because they more toward to replace the incumbent president with another opposition party. So that's the kind of one things that you might want to remember, that we still don't know the exact policy lines from the candidate Yoon, and it is still in the making, but there will be a huge opposition against this government as well. And also you mentioned that there was the smallest margins in these elections. It was actually less than 1%, which means that there are huge polarizations between conservative and progressive. But you might want to notice that there are kind of differences between, the parliaments and actual public opinions. In the parliaments, there will be a huge polarizations, and their partisanship will be completing in every domains of policy. But when you look at the public opinion level, there are kind of different landscapes, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Public opinion is more favorable to candidate Yoon. They are more favorable to the U.S. ROK relations, and they are more actually hostile to the China and Russia and North Korea's behavior. So that's the kind of environments that Yoon administration has to consider when they are making their new policies, not only foreign policy, but they will be kind of competing with opposition party in every policy domain. So.
Thank you. That's a nice startup. Perhaps we have to think about some of the domestic politics issue later. And Jenny, could you give us your initial remark, thought?
Sure. Thanks, Sang-Hyun, and thank you to Sejong Institute for inviting me. I look forward to hopefully doing this in person again soon, as it seems that window of opportunity is opening again. Unfortunately, I think the window of opportunity with North Korea, however, seems to be a little bit further out of reach. And while while Yoon won by very small margins, I think it will have very big shifts on North Korea policy. And so I know we're getting into some of these points later on in the discussion, so I just wanted to lay out some broad strokes on what we expect to see from the Yoon administration and its approach to North Korea. And most significantly, I think, we expect a shift away from the peace-building approach of the Moon administration, and the political will to provide incentives up front to create an environment more conducive to negotiations is going to cease. And so, as we move back to a more mainstream traditional approach where inter-Korean relations are really dependent on progress made on North Korea's denuclearization, this means that, with incentives still possible in response to positive North Korean actions and disincentives remaining in place until that time comes. I know we'll see issues of, for instance, human rights in North Korea come back into focus, as well as reviving work specified under the North Korean Human Rights Act, as well as plans apparently to revamp and improve refugee resettlement conditions for North Korean refugees. And while this approach is both understandable, given the lack of progress in inter-Korean relations since 2019, and the reversal of some of the positive developments during that period, it comes at a time of rising US-China competition, which has been fueling a regional arms race in the region that has been intensifying in recent years. And so, especially with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and deepening US relations with regional allies and the formation of new and additional regional security arrangements and pacts like AUKUS, as well as North Korea's resumption of major weapons testing. And I think, the implications of this for the regional security trends are that it will be more difficult to get international consensus on what to do about North Korea for the foreseeable future, with divisions forming along, the reformation of these ideological blocs. And even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw Russia and China refusing to impose new sanctions through the UN Security Council, which is now effectively paralyzed by the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think overall, the idea that North Korea must act first in order for positive developments to happen, the idea that they'll decide to come to the table anytime soon to negotiate putting limits or even reversing course on its WMD development, while the rest of the region, including South Korea, is arming up, I think is really unrealistic. And, you're not just building nuclear deterrent as a bargaining chip for economic gains, but there is a self-defense component to it as well. And one that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of a non-nuclear armed state having to fight off a larger nuclear armed adversary, is likely only to reinforce the threat perception of what happens to states that don't have nuclear weapons. I think, in the short term and foreseeable future, I think there might be greater agreements among the US, South Korea, and Japan on an approach to North Korea. I think it's going to be very rocky inter-Korean relations in the near term.
Well, thank you, Jenny. That'll be enough for thought for the start. We'll talk a little bit in detail about North Korea policy change and perhaps coordination between Korea and US in the later part. Dr. Sung, could you give us some thought about the election and general prospect?
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for organizing this timely event. I think the winning of Yoon Suk-yeol in this election was basically the expression of South Korean people's desire to change the ruling power. So the economic issues such as property price and bad job market, and some normative issues such as ruling elite's hypocrisy, 내로남불, the famous Korean word, dominated the election agenda. On the other hand, foreign policy and North Korea issues did not constitute any major debate points in this election campaign. But if you look back, North Korea issues have been one of the fiercest battleground between ruling and opposition party in the major elections of South Korea. How to perceive North Korea in the political context and how to deal with North Korea in the inter-Korean relations has drawn a clear and very thick dividing line between progress and conservative camps. In this election too, there was a little bit of debate on North Korea between Yoon Suk-yeol and Lee Jae-myung. While Lee Jae-myung largely inherited the Moon Jae-in administration's North Korea policy, Yoon Suk-yeol accused the Moon government of taking a kind of subservient attitude to North Korea. Yoon's point was that the Moon government paid too much attention to North Korea issues in the entire foreign policy. For example, it was his argument that the Moon government made too much effort to achieve the end of war declaration, which was highly unlikely from his point of view due to North Korea's indifference and even highly counterproductive. Another element to explain the indifferences to North Korea issues in this election was limitation of policy tool to actually deal with North Korea. Even though the Moon Jae-in administration made every effort to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table, North Korea has been completely ignoring the role of South Korea since the Hanoi failure in 2019. Entire foreign policy agenda did not offer any critical factor either to decide a winner or a loser of this election. But what I can remember, one of the interesting points was the fact that both candidates tried to stimulate the anti-China sentiment of South Korean public during the Beijing Winter Olympic Games. As some of you may remember, the South Korean short track speed skaters were disqualified due to a series of questionable referee judgment. And as a result, Chinese players won gold and silver medal. So this stolen Olympic medal allegation became widespread among the South Korean public. And many politicians began to add their voice on that. For example, candidate Yoon Suk-yeol posted a famous Korean pop song called Dreaming Balhae in his social media, Facebook. Balhae is the ancient Korean dynasty which had been located in Manchuria region more than 1,000 years ago. Lee Jae-myung went further by saying we have to destroy the illegal Chinese fishing boats in the West Sea if the incursion happens. What this episode shows us is during the election, we missed a chance to seriously discuss the change of geopolitical environment of the Korean Peninsula and many regional and global issues. Instead, the candidates tried to stimulate nationalistic sentiment toward the neighboring countries, which was pretty disappointing to me.
Well, thank you. You also, Dr. Song, raised an important issue. You touched the general, very broadly, foreign policy stance of the Yoon government, and including anti-Chinese emotion in Korea. I think that will be another issue that we can look into later. Okay, Scott, could you give us some thought?
Yes, well, first of all, I want to compliment all of the three prior presenters for their comments, and I'll try not to repeat anything that they have said. And also, I want to give my thanks to Sejong for inviting me. If I were in the Biden administration looking at the campaign, and in particular looking at the Yoon campaign platform, there are three particular elements that I think I would really be welcoming and embracing. One is the comprehensive strategic alliance concept, which basically places the relationship with the United States as the centerpiece of South Korean foreign policy. Two is the global pivotal state, because it means that South Korea is really promising to step up and be a major power in provision of international public goods. And the third is the prospect of an enhanced trilateral US-South Korea-Japan relationship. Those are all things that I think the Biden administration will very much welcome, because the Biden administration in Asia is going to be focused on China, also concerned about North Korea. But I think that the big question is that as Biden and Yoon begin to work together, what are the potential unintended consequences, both externally and domestically, that could become problematic? And here what I see is that, on North Korea, well, I think the North Koreans were going to be a problem for any South Korean president, and that they were on a trajectory that was going to lead to tensions and conflict with the United States at some point. But with the conservative administration, I think the amplitude of the conflict may be greater because the North Koreans tend to basically, they're going to want to do the same thing that the Yoon administration says that it wants to do, and that is pursue peace through strength. So what I worry about is a crisis emanating from a competition between Yoon and Kim Jong-un to try to show who is strongest. And then subsequently that could lead to diplomacy. Second, we see with Yoon, an alignment with the United States that is very clear that the Biden administration is going to welcome, but we have to be concerned about how China might respond to that. And we need to be thinking, I think, a lot in South Korea about how to manage the diplomacy around that alignment. And in particular, I think the concern is that, China, in response to Yoon's election, expressed anxiety and sent a lot of veiled warnings through the media because it's pretty clear that the Yoon campaign is stepping on some Chinese red lines that China had put out previously. And so these are challenges that have to be managed. And then thirdly, I think that the issue of how things develop in terms of the domestic support for the Yoon foreign policy is critical. And already I note that it seems that public opinion polling is a little bit tepid for Yoon. But for Yoon to be able to deliver on foreign policy, the US and the Biden administration is going to want to see that he has a strong domestic political base. And I think that there should be concerns that his efforts to align with the US could be derailed if the relationship with the United States or other aspects of South Korean foreign policy become overly politicized domestically in South Korea.
Well, thank you, Scott. Wrapping up for experts' initial remark, it sounds to me that perhaps United States and Japan be feeling a little more optimistic toward the Yoon administration, whereas China and North Korea may be a little uncomfortable with these policies because Yoon's policy may be surely a little tougher on North Korea. And also use policies a little more pro-alliance stance. So having said that, as Scott, you mentioned, so there is of course there are some problems already. For example, perhaps you heard who are in Yoon's transition team in foreign and security policy area. Kim Sung-han is chairing that foreign policy division, and Kim Tae-hyo is joining them. And also many other people who worked for Lee Myung-bak administration joined the transition team, and perhaps their initial idea will be put much more input in Yoon's foreign policy stance in general. So some people say that Yoon may inherit a lot of policy elements from Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, meaning that his policy may be a little hawkish, maybe. So how do you feel about that policy orientation?
Well, it's interesting. Was that directed to me, or I'll begin a response on that. I think that it's interesting that the Biden administration team has faced the same kind of burden of being perceived as Obama 2.0. And yet the big difference is that the nature of the North Korean challenge, in fact, has evolved and changed. And so I think that it means that neither the former Obama administration officials in the Biden administration nor the former MB officials in the Yoon administration can afford to simply fall back on their old policy stances. They have to evolve to meet the challenge, and the clear problem that no one has solved is that North Korea continues to march on in its military development.
Or I myself served the MOFA for the year 2011 to 13, which was the last years of Lee Myung-bak administration. And at that time, Kim Sung-han was the second vice minister of the foreign MOFA, and Kim Tae-hyo was a key political advisor to Blue House. So looking back those years, perhaps their policy may be relevant during that time frame. But my concern is that if they continue their thought or perspective that dominated 2011-13 time frame and apply that in today's framework, I think that will be problematic. Will they change their perspective and to be more realistic, looking at today's different situation? For example, those Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities have been much more upgraded than those years. So what's your reaction? Anybody? Yeah, Dr. Song.
Well, I have been reading the election manifesto of Yoon's team on foreign policy and North Korea policy. And from my reading, I think we need to note two things. First of all, the first chapter of his election manifesto on North Korea is titled Normalization of Inter-Korean Relations, Normalization. A clear assumption of this title is that the inter-Korean relations under the Moon Jae-in administration was built on abnormal or at least unfair, unequal relationship with North Korea. There were no mentioning of the new government's commitment, Yoon Suk-yeol government commitment to fully respect the existing inter-Korean agreements, including Panmunjom Declaration and September 19 inter-Korean military agreement. Instead, what Yoon Suk-yeol said during the campaign was it would depend on North Korea's willingness to implement the agreement and the national consensus of South Korea. But Dr. Lee, you mentioned the early days of the Lee Myung-bak administration. If you look back, what happened at the early stage of Lee Myung-bak administration in 2008, I remember the first inter-Korean conflict came from Lee Myung-bak's comments pointing out the importance of the 1990 Inter-Korean Basic Agreement, which was made under the Roh Tae-woo administration. Intentionally, Lee Myung-bak did not mention the historical June 15 joint declaration in 2000 between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il. He did not mention the October 4th joint declaration in 2007 between Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Jong-il. Will the same thing happen? We have to see. But I was a little bit impressed by when the transition team member mentioned that, quote and unquote, many Korean people assumes that the new government's North Korea policy will be very tough and hardline, but actually we aim to achieve the practical North Korea policy after they were briefed by the Ministry of Unification. I think that was a very prudent and wise approach in dealing with North Korea issues at the initial stage of transition team. But unfortunately, this good gesture was not accepted by the North when they launched a new ICBM several days ago. So I think this North Korea's movement will provide the Yoon's transition team and the new government with more a tougher approach in designing and figuring out the policy tool of the new government's North Korea policy.
Well, thank you. Yeah, JD.
If I could just add to that, I do think the people who are on the transition team of foreign policy and national security realm are, well experienced and I think are well aware of the changed security dynamics of today also. And I think, as Dr. Sung was saying, I do think a lot of that is reflected in the plans that they put forward for North Korea. My concerns are, one, that we do have a rookie politician who is now president. And the question is how closely will he listen to his advisors? And, or will he fall into the sort of Trumpism of saying, really uncalled for, really unthoughtful comments. And then the administration has to rush to try and fix things afterwards, or whether he will stick to talking points and be able to navigate this very delicate, complicated set of relations. But I do think there's also, my biggest concern now is now that we are moving towards a more hardline stance where, it has put the relationship back on a threat basis. And with the rising US-China competition and these reformation of these ideological blocks, it makes it difficult to see where the political off-ramps are going to come from, because it's much harder now to get US-China cooperation on this issue, to get, while there might be better trilateral cooperation, you're not going to have tools like the UN Security Council and further resolutions, or any kind of unanimous international response in this situation. So it is a situation where the wrong words could very, very easily lead to greater escalation, and it would be much more difficult, I think, to find those options in the future as things continue to.
Well, so far about Yoon's presidency, I feel there are two kinds of reaction. One is that first is that Yoon is not a Korea politician. He has no experience in foreign policy and North Korea issue. So people are concerned about his lack of a competence in those policy area. But in other ways, some people argue that Yoon is not a Korea politician. And perhaps after his presidency, he will not continue politics. Then what's he afraid of? He's nothing to lose. So because of that, some people say that Yoon may approach those complicated issues more broadly, more bravely. And let's see what would happen in the future. Well, after initial remark, let's shift our gear toward a little bit on North Korea policy. Dr. Song, how do you evaluate Moon Jae-in government's North Korea policy, and what kind of a policy change do you expect in Yoon's administration? As you mentioned recently, North Korea did not hide their intention to develop ICBM Hwasong-17. In the past, they usually covered it as a satellite launch, but this time they openly talked it was an ICBM. And perhaps their provocation will continue. And in that context, if you compare Moon Jae-in administration to North Korea policy and Yoon's policy, what will be the major change?
Well, the primary aim of the Yoon Suk-yeol government's North Korea policy is complete and verifiable denuclearization of North Korea. His foreign policy and North Korea policy team stressed the predictable denuclearization roadmap, the principle of reciprocity in dealing with North Korea, and principled and consistent denuclearization negotiation, and so on and so forth. But what we need to pay attention to is that the foreign policy team and North Korea policy team of Yoon's camp did not use the word denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Instead, they used the word of denuclearization of North Korea. This is a critically different approach in dealing with and in looking at North Korea's nuclear issue. That will be I think the first conflictual points between North Korea and South Korea, or the external world. But with regard to the North Korea's behavior, I think in order to explain the recent North Korea's provocative behavior, we need to pay attention, push factors and pull factors equally. I think the biggest push factor is North Korea's own 5 years defense capability development plan, which was announced in the 8th Party Congress January last year. There's a long, very long list of accomplishments North Korea has been aiming within the next 4 to 5 years, including, of course, hypersonic missiles, advanced technology of ICBM and spy satellite, and so on. So the recent ICBM launch is part of Kim Jong-un's efforts to consolidate his power base while he tried to conceal economic hardship of the country. On the other hand, there are pull factors as well to explain why North Korea takes a series of provocative actions in this particular time. That could be, for example, Russia-Ukrainian war. The American foreign policy was binded in the European front, and the increasing US-China strategic competition. They are looking at geopolitical, they are riding geopolitical tightrope between the two countries, and power transition in South Korea, and North Korea's growing solidarity with Russia and China. So there are a lot of factors that North Korea is reluctant to come back to the negotiating table, even though the Yoon Suk-yeol government wanted to show goodwill gesture and send goodwill gesture to North Korea at the initial year of his term.
Well, it sounds to me that you are saying that Kim Jong-un, for the time being, maybe not interested in opening dialogue with South Korea. And probably, given the long list of a weapon system they want to develop in the future, perhaps they will continue all sorts of a missile test and kind of provocations. That means, perhaps that means that we don't have much chance to open a fresh and new dialogue between two Koreas. Is that the case?
Unfortunately, yes, for the time being. If you look at the Yoon Suk-yeol transition team's North Korea policy manifesto, there are a series of friendly gestures to North Korea. For example, humanitarian assistance, humanitarian support, and sanction measures, temporary sanction measures in the event of North Korea's substantial denuclearization measures is taken in the future. But the thing is, North Korea even denies the necessity of humanitarian assistance and support from South Korea. One-sided approach is not interested. North Korea is not interested in one-sided approaches such as assistance and support. The Moon Jae-in administration instead used the word humanitarian cooperation to bring North Korea's attention back to the inter-Korean relations. There are, in the past, during the Moon Jae-in administration, there are 3 no's, for example, in looking at the inter-Korean humanitarian project. No official government agreement, no agreement document, and no reports, and no, I forgot the last one. Anyway, North Korea is not interested in, for the time being, even the humanitarian activity from South Korea.
Well, thank you. Well, if that's the South Korean interpretation, let's look at, let's try to hear what's the U.S. perspective on Yoon government's North Korea policy. Jenny, could you talk about how does the U.S. expect South Korea's North Korea policy will change in the future, and how Biden's North Korea policy, the so-called calibrated practical approach, how can it match with the U.S. policy in the future? Do you expect any problem or trouble, or do you see much greater opportunity in ROK-US collaboration on North Korean issue?
Sure. Before I do, I just wanted to pick up on one point that that Dr. Sung made, and I agree with a lot of his comments and a lot of his assessment. I would just add to that when we're looking at why North Korea is testing, at the pace of testing, and what it's testing, but yes, a lot of this is domestically driven. These are all goals that have been developed, over the years. Were announced at the 8th Party Congress last year. But in terms of what those goals were that they set, I think, you know, a lot of these goals really reflect some of the regional trends, such as on hypersonics and ICBM expansion. Some of it counters a growing US ROK missile defense capabilities. But I think some of the pacing reflects South Korea's own missile testing, as we saw at the end of last year. And so, you know, when it comes to the opportunity to, you know, resume inter-Korean relations, I think it's also difficult to see how that happens when South Korea is also moving forward with its missile developments. In terms of the US policy and how the Biden administration is likely viewing the North Korea policy, I think it's probably a welcome change. I think it matches better, you know, with the sort of sequencing and pacing that the Biden administration is comfortable with, the idea that, you know, North Korea should move first and that actions can be reciprocated. But as we've seen in terms of, you know, a reluctance to give anything up front or to provide incentives, unilateral incentives, and an uncomfortable, you know, debate that's gone on about the end of war declaration, again, without any North Korean moves to justify that. I think this will be a welcome change in the Biden administration as to, you know, how to approach it. I think it would be welcomed by Tokyo as well. I just wonder, though, that, you know, given the conditions right now, I think it's very unlikely that we'll get negotiations, that North Korea will be willing to take the first move anytime soon. And in that environment, you know, will President Yoon's focus move towards domestic issues or other regional security issues? And does those changing priorities, will that also alleviate pressure on the US to actually deal with the North Korea issue in a meaningful and way? So there's a lot of synergy here with what the Biden administration wants to do. I'm not sure it will necessarily be effective in actually dealing with North Korea.
Well, I feel like one of the problems with the Biden administration is that perhaps Biden may be too busy with the different businesses. China, US competition is one thing, and recently Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think there's a kind of black hole for US foreign policy. Biden's attention is wholly devoted to those issues, and which means that North Korea policy may be a very low priority in his policy agenda. So having said that, what do you think, how Yoon and Biden can work together to make North Korea as a top priority in Biden's agenda?
Well, you know, theoretically, the administration can walk and chew gum at the same time. They do have a North Korea team. They do have at least a part-time North Korea envoy, as well as a deputy envoy. I think the attitude is not necessarily that the US isn't focused on this right now, but that, you know, the North Koreans are uninterested at the moment. And I think as long as there isn't reciprocation from the North Korean side, I think it's very difficult to see how much attention will be maintained on this issue. Unfortunately, I think we have to remember on the North Korean side too, though, you know, part of their reluctance is that there's also a very high personal risk for the North Koreans when they engage in diplomacy to actually get results. And so I think until there's a greater confidence that, you know, negotiations can lead to outcomes in the short term, I think it'll be very difficult to convince the North Koreans to come back to the table. And again, especially in an environment where everyone else is still ramping up. So I think questions also need to be asked about, you know, what South Korea is willing to do on that front. And if, you know, we're asking for like a moratorium on North Korean missile testing, if South Korea is willing to do a moratorium as well. I think those are questions that need to be asked in the near future among the alliance to see what our possibilities actually are.
Well, recently, I didn't hear much about Biden's North Korea policy. It was last year that Biden government finished the policy review on North Korea, and the practical, calibrated practical approach came out as a policy review. And since then, do you believe there is any progress in implementing that calibrated practical approach since then?
Not really. I think, you know, this idea that the administration is open to negotiations anytime, anywhere. It's a very open-ended and ambiguous call, but it doesn't really build any confidence that it can be results-oriented, and that if the North Koreans come back, that there's a deal to be made. I think there's the sting of the failure of Hanoi, of this, you know, very high stakes diplomatic chance that the North Koreans took, and came home with nothing. I think that's going to take a long time for that burn to heal. So, you know, I think until we have a more concrete proposal and messaging, and, you know, something that builds confidence that, you know, that not only is there something concrete on the table in the short term while we try and negotiate longer term objectives, but that we also are working on the regional security environment and recognize that this isn't just North Korea trying to get economic concessions, but that there are actual, you know, underlying security concerns to this as well, and that in order to actually make progress, we're going to need to deal with the regional security environment as well.
Okay, thank you. Before moving to a foreign policy area, Dr. Chung or Scott, do you have any add-on on those Korean issue? Okay, if you don't, let's move to a general foreign policy stance of the Yoon administration. Dr. Chung, how do you expect Yoon administration foreign policy stance will change in comparison with the Moon administration? We already mentioned about some of the China factor, anti-Chinese emotion in South Korea, and Japan factor. And also, could you talk a little bit about Yoon's foreign policy vision, the so-called global pivotal state?
Right. Well, I think the major difference between Moon administration and Yoon, candidate President-elect Yoon, is how they perceive the role and status of South Korea in the global stage. So when it comes to Moon administrations, they perceive South Korea as a balancer in Northeast Asia. And of course, they perceive US-China competition as something they can avoid of. In other words, we are not actually participating in this competition, but more of hedging between two great power competitions. And sometimes they try to forge a third coalitions that can navigate this competition between great powers. So, but that actually created and linked to the North Korea policy as well. But when it comes to Yoon, President-elect Yoon, he is more toward to liberal order as well as U.S. network in the Indo-Pacific, and tried to be more active player in liberal coalitions overall. And as you can see from this phone call that President-elect Yoon is making to kind of regional countries' leaders, he made the first phone call with President Biden, and next one was Japan, and China was actually backburnered, and that shows his foreign policy priorities and how they will deal with the regional countries in the coming his term. And also, he also seems to understand this strengthening U.S. ROK alliances is not just about bandwagoning anymore. Given the current transition of global orders, he understands that strengthening alliances and strengthening liberal coalitions in the world stage means that South Korea needs to contribute to maintain global liberal order at this moment. So he understands. So that's why, as Scott mentions, South Korea tried to figure out how to contribute the sustaining of global order and public goods, and the global pivot strategy that might be coming out in soon from the transition team will cover more about how South Korea can sustain and support current declining liberal orders and try to find its places more than just middle power. So as you can see from President-elect Yoon's discourses and rhetorics, he rarely mentions about middle power discourses. It seems that he is beyond just middle powers, but be more active players in the global stage. So I think that's the kind of major differences about how they perceive current US-China competitions and how they perceive declining liberal order, and how South Korea can contribute to manage it. So in that sense, there are a few specific foreign policy that President-elect Yoon mentioned during his campaign. When it, first of all, like Quad Plus, and there was some negative response about this policy from the United States, that the United States is not considering adding more members to Quad Plus at this moment, but South Korea, especially Yoon administration, will pursue and try to figure out how they can fit into Quad Plus and other regional and bilateral cooperations. And also specific policy is still in the making. They will come up with more non-traditional security and security issues, and they will try to figure out how they can manage those issues. And also, as you mentioned about Japan factor, trilateral cooperation between US, South Korea and Japan cooperation. Of course, there will be some kind of hurdles, and already there is a problem coming out from Japan from the textbook issue. But South Korea tried to manage this historical and issue with strategic issue and try to figure out dual track so that they can feel more comfortable with this trilateral cooperation to manage North Korea issue and beyond North Korea and North Korea regional issue. So I'll stop here.
Well, looking back, the Lee Myung-bak administration era, do you remember one of the big keywords during those years was the global Korea? And South Korean government tried to impose its engagement with many global issues, and also expand its cooperative network all over the world. So do you think any parallel between global Korea and Yoon's foreign policy stance?
I guess there will be some kind of parallels. Well, actually, Moon administration was not. It's not like they were not global, but they are more focused on North Korea policy. So there will be some kind of parallels and parallels from Moon administrations, and especially when it comes to like New Southern policy and other regional initiative, there will be. They will continue in the new administration, but with different names. But in that sense, they will, try to emphasize to be more globalized and try to contribute how South Korea can to maintain the regional order as well.
Okay, great. Scott, this time let's try to hear what's the U.S. Evaluation of Korea's foreign policy stance and changes in the Yoon administration. And you mentioned that one of the good signs for Yoon is that he tried to implement a comprehensive strategic alliance. Do you believe that idea, policy initiative, will continue smoothly in the future?
I think there's a lot of areas where there are opportunities for strengthened cooperation between the United States and South Korea. And ironically, those were all fleshed out in the Moon-Biden joint statement, which provides actually a very strong foundation and platform for pursuing comprehensive cooperation. I think that the Yoon team will be hard-pressed to add new items to that agenda for cooperation, but of course there is a lot to be done in terms of implementation. And I would just add, building on what Professor Chung said about Yoon's framework of a global pivotal state, it turns out that one of the near-term opportunities for the Yoon administration as they come into office is actually going to be in the context of the alliance to strengthen cooperation with NATO and the European Union. And there are opportunities for South Korea, for instance, in the humanitarian sphere, to make its generosity known in addressing humanitarian aid to Ukrainian refugees. And of course, that primarily is going to occur in Europe. And so, you know, that in of itself, if Yoon pursues it, would be a big additional step that is very much aligned with the concept of a comprehensive strategic alliance.
Well, as far as the alliance is concerned, perhaps last year's Moon Jae-in-Biden summit and its statement quite closely already reflect those spirit of comprehensive strategic alliance. Reading again last year's summit statement, sometimes I'm surprised. Is it a Moon government's statement? It sounds like a Lee Myung-bak or a Yoon government's statement. And looking back, perhaps there will be some continuity. But I also believe that there will be much more challenging because the global situation and uncertainty is increasing. And how do you expect the future of that policy stance in the coming years?
Well, a lot of hard work is going to remain to be done. But I think the important thing is that Yoon is expressing, you know, that the centerpiece of his approach is really alignment with the United States, and that it's going to be comprehensive in scope. And actually that meets the very high expectations that the Biden administration is going to be having toward North Korea in principle. So then the question really ends up being, you know, about implementation. And, you know, that could be a little bit tougher because as the Yoon administration tries to implement very close cooperation with the United States, as I suggested earlier, they're going to run into some obstacles and roadblocks. And some of them are going to come from China. Some of them are going to come from South Korea's own specific interests that may not always be in perfect alignment with those of the United States. But, you know, overall, I think as a framework, the Biden administration could not ask for anything more favorable, precisely because South Korea is standing up and saying exactly where it stands in the context of the rivalry and competition between the democratic and the authoritarian respective leaderships.
Well, one more point is that you briefly mentioned about Korea, US, Japan trilateral security cooperation. But as you know, between Korea and Japan, we have a lot of challenges, even though Yoon administration will be inaugurated. So even though Yoon has a little more flexible view on Japan-Korea relations, but do you expect Yoon will handle those complicated issues?
Well, I personally like what candidate Yoon had to say about Japan. I actually thought that it was somewhat courageous for a South Korean presidential candidate in the middle of a campaign to say something positive about the Korea-Japan relationship. But I think that what really remains to be seen, you know, two factors. One, these comfort women and forced labor issues have become structural obstacles, impediments to improved Korea-Japan relations. And so the Yoon team is going to have to find a way to effectively manage those issues and actually in a way that doesn't generate political backlash domestically. And then secondly, Yoon is going to need a partner in the Japanese leadership that is just as willing to take a courageous stance in favor of Korea in order to convince the considerable negative sentiment that exists in Japan towards South Korea, especially among conservatives in Japan, to follow on and actually take steps to improve the bilateral relationship. So I don't forecast that it will be easy for Yoon to fulfill his campaign pledge to raise the level of the relationship to the Kim Dae-jung Obuchi level. But I think it's the right sentiment and it's the right direction. And it actually becomes an implicit challenge to the leadership of the government of Japan to pursue statesmanship over legalistic approaches to the relationship.
Well, I agree with you that it may not be easy to overcome complicated challenges in Korea-Japan bilateral relationship, but I expect there may be some positive change in the coming years. So having said that, for the remaining half hour, I will ask you about what do you believe is most important risk in facing Yoon administration in handling Korea-US relations. What should the Yoon government do and should not do in the handling this US-Korea bilateral relationship? So Korean side may start. Dr. Jung, could you give us some thought? What is the most important risk? Yeah.
Well, I think there are risks as well as some kind of things that Yoon administration has to avoid, I think. I don't think this is a risk, but seamless management, as you know, between U.S. and ROK governments are necessary. And it's not like we have different perspective on the regional order and different understanding of national interests, but it seems like we have different priorities. So, as many experts has mentioned, United States moving more toward to responding China and now Russia. And South Korea, we are fully aware of North Korea's provocations, and this different priority makes some kind of problem, not necessarily a risk. So this could be managed in a seamless way. And another thing that might affect this US-ROK coordinations would be the legacy of Moon administrations. And I think especially about a few confidence building measures between North and South Korea might be a hurdle and obstacles in coordinating US-ROK alliances in the future, especially when it comes to deterrence, strengthening deterrence that South Korea actually wanted to, might be discussed in addition to this. How to manage this confidence building measure that has been established during the Moon administrations. And also Scott mentions about this escalation control, and South Korea's coming governments will be more focused on deterrence and strengthening their military capability. So they will be more responding, not just remain at the restraint level. They are responding to a more proactive way to North Korea's provocation. So in that sense, South Korea and United States have to work on how to manage this escalation control in the Korean Peninsula as well. So I guess that's the kind of things that South Korea and US need to focus on. It's not necessarily a risk, but it's kind of things that South Korea need to consider when they are coordinating their policy with the United States.
And what should the Yoon administration do in early years toward the United States, and what it should not do?
When it comes to what it should do, I think South Korea, administration need to make a kind of clear foreign policy in the first place. I think, as I mentioned, during this campaign, South Korea administration didn't really make a clear position about foreign policy and specific roadmap how to make a coordination with the United States and other regional powers. So that should be the first one, that South Korea need to signal their willingness to coordinate with other countries. But what it should not do, they should coordinate with other countries. It's a kind of same thing, but it would kind of, there would be kind of different sequences and different priorities. So that should be the kind of management that South Korea need to with other countries as well.
Well, thank you. I'll ask the similar question to Jenny. What do you think is the most important risk of the Biden administration's relationship with South Korea, and what should it do and should not do?
I think one of the biggest risks that we face in the alliance is not anticipating potential backlash. So if the US wants South Korea to be more, to have greater strategic clarity in the competition between the US and China, I think we need to anticipate what Chinese reactions are going to be, and coordinate response, and plan for responding to such backlash. And I think this is especially evident given, China's response to the bad deployment in 2016 and the economic toll that took, and how much that has been imprinted on South Korean decision making in the subsequent years. So I think, going forward, we have to enable the alliance to grow by providing, more than just military support, but also, economic and political support in the face of, potential political and economic backlash for the decisions being made on behalf of the alliance. I think the second thing too, though, is that, while the US and South Korea might be better aligned on North Korea, and willing to take a tougher stance on North Korea, I think we need to also be thinking about how do we create political off-ramps to potential escalation, sort of the flip side of what Dr. Chung was saying, not just managing escalation, but a focus on regional nuclear risk reduction in general, given all of the divisiveness of the security situation right now.
Okay, Dr. Song, could you give us your thought about risk and should do and should not do?
Risks. I want to mention two things. First one is the Yoon government's foreign policy risk in the outside world, and the second one is the domestic factors. I think paradoxically, China factor is going to be the biggest risk in Yoon government foreign policy. This is also, of course, related to the ROK-US bilateral relations. As we know, during the campaign, Yoon's foreign policy team accused the Moon administration of pursuing a pro-China policy. It signaled the China policy of the new government will be much tougher than the Moon administration, especially if China takes any coercive political or economic measures like the THAAD retaliation. China factor will also lead to South Korea's potential burden in strengthening the trilateral security coordination among the ROK, US, and Japan, which the Biden administration has been pushing forward. In fact, the Moon administration wanted to limit the trilateral security cooperation to joint diplomatic efforts to resolve North Korea issues alone. But the Yoon administration is more likely to use the trilateral cooperation to militarily deter North Korea's provocation. And the United States is ready to widen the scope of security cooperation among the three countries. So the strengthened military cooperation between the United States and Japan is already a push factor for South Korea to join the trilateral cooperation with a substantial military contribution. This trilateral military cooperation among the three countries will also be the domestic controversial factors, I think. Yoon Suk-yeol government's emphasis on the trilateral cooperation may bring about backlash in the domestic politics if the alliance and cooperation, trilateral cooperation, fails to deter North Korea's military provocation. For example, if the escalated tension caused by the North Korea's provocation and the US following military reaction with the strategic asset deployment around the Korean Peninsula is prolonged, in the end, I think it will cause South Korean people's anxiety and fatigue. So it is also a possibility for the opposition party to use this kind of a situation to blame President Yoon Suk-yeol's inability or incompetence to peacefully manage the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. One more, in some cases, I guess opposition party will form a coalition with the peace campaigners from the South Korean civil society. There has been very wide group of strong supporters for the reconciliation of the Korean Peninsula situation. If the opposition party's political will and political aim is combined with the civil society group's peace campaign on the streets, if this kind of situation occurred, it will make the Yoon government difficult to achieve successful foreign policy and North Korea policy at the early stage of its term.
Well, I fully agree that perhaps one of the main challenges for Yoon administration is the some of the negative environment in domestic politics. One thing, look at the National Assembly of South Korea. Conservative takes only 110 seats out of 300. It means that opposition party will continue to influence or restrict Yoon's policy agenda, both in North Korea and alliance issue. So having said that, Scott, could you give us some thought about risk and should do and should not do from Biden's perspective?
Yeah, well, I think that the subject has been very well covered by the other presenters, but I just want to underscore that from my perspective, the biggest risk actually for both sides is to resist taking steps that can result in the politicization of the alliance. We're in such a good place right now with a situation where it was actually the Moon-Biden joint statement that frames an agenda for a comprehensive security alliance. But there are a lot of ways in which either the Yoon team or the Biden team can be entrapped by allowing the relationship to become politicized again. Professor Sung mentioned some of those risks. But I would say that, I don't want the Yoon team to come to Washington and complain very much about what the Moon team had done in the past. Instead, I think they should look forward and talk about what else they are going to do. And likewise, I think that the Biden administration needs to take steps to avoid the risk of entrapment in South Korean political debates. I think that also is relevant in terms of the ways in which both North Korea and China can try to use strategies designed to exploit potential divisions between the Yoon administration and South Korean domestic sentiment should they arise. So I agree a lot with the prior comments that were made in that direction.
Well, I think, Scott, you raised a very important point. And usually Washington is kind of a battleground for South Korea's liberal as conservatives to promote their policy initiative. I don't want to see that happens again in Washington, D.C. Well, this discussion leads us to the final question. President-elect Yoon will soon send a delegation to discuss bilateral policy issues in Washington, D.C. Congressman Park Jin will head the delegation. And perhaps this delegation mission may include preparing a Yoon-Biden summit in May, possibly. So could you suggest what should be the most important agenda in this summit? And what kind of recommendation do you would like to suggest for both Yoon and Biden? So who will start? Jenny, do you start?
The easy question, right? So I think that, you know, in this preparatory meeting and on the agenda, I think, you know, I think the expansion of the alliance and how this is going to work and build over time, you know, is going to be the #1 priority. And especially how to make it sustainable. And I think, you know, especially with the Chinese have expressed concerns over these kinds of moves. But the idea is that with this greater economic cooperation does also create some buffer for South Korea in the face of Chinese economic coercion as well. So the more that this can advance and the greater that this can deepen, I think the more the US is able to, you know, support South Korea in different ways for different decisions made by the alliance. But obviously North Korea will be high on the agenda as well as to, you know, how to address, you know, potential provocations from the North Koreans and their continued development, especially of long-range weapons, potentially nuclear weapons in the near future. And I think how we respond to that, especially with the UN Security Council paralyzed at the moment, will be very important. And important to think about also, again, in that process of how to build in off-ramp to escalation as well. So it's one thing to show a strong response and condemnation, but at the same time, not to the point where we're back to 2017 playing chicken with nuclear weapons.
Okay, Dr. Chung, how do you suggest your recommendation?
Yeah, I mostly agree with Jenny about her recommendations to a coming meeting between US and ROK. Yeah, but the first thing is that both United States and South Korea knows that they are highly in alignment to each other. Then in the case of Moon and Biden administrations, they know that they have common interests and they have more aligned approach to achieve that goals. The thing is that how they can, you know, make a kind of effective way of sequencing those goals and priorities. And they need to come up with how United States will approach in the Pacific vis-a-vis great power competition with China. And South Korea needs to respond how their priority, our priority, which is North Korea, and also strengthening our status and position on the Indo-Pacific can be coordinated with US approach in the region. So we need to think about the big picture in the first place, and then figure out the specifics in economics and deterrence, of course, as recently DOD mentions provide about national defense strategy. So we need to figure out many specifics in terms of deterrence as well as military preparedness. And so I think that's the kind of priority. We need to focus more on priority and common goals in the first place.
Thank you. Scott?
Well, I actually look at this issue, I think, thinking about two levels. You know, one is the leader level. And, you know, really, it's just fortuitous circumstances that are going to bring Biden and Yoon together so early in Yoon's term. And at that level, the important thing is really establishing the personal relationship and chemistry and level of commitment to each other as effective partners. And so an early meeting is really, you know, perfect because it's actually too early for anyone to expect a long list of pledges and promises between the two leaders, and yet the symbolism of having come together at such an early point in Yoon's term will be there. But at the working level, there are a lot of things that need to be coordinated between the two countries. Professor Chung talked about deterrence policy, and I think there's a lot of in-depth discussion that is going to be required in order to deal with that as related to North Korea. I think that also South Korea has already indicated, and the Yoon administration has already indicated an interest in continuing expanding closer cooperation on supply chain resiliency, which is one of the Biden administration priorities. There's a whole set of other issues, that are on the agenda. Really, I think one of the most important challenges for both governments is going to be to develop a much more active and multi-dimensional process for coordinating policy on all the dimensions of China policy. And there I can think of what has emerged as opportunities for a technology alliance. There's going to be continued desire on the part of the US to see South Korea cooperate across the Indo-Pacific with the United States. With the new policy, not the new Southern policy, but I guess what Yoon appears to be calling the ABCD policy for Southeast Asia. The challenges related to upholding the rule of law in the region and how South Korea relates to those efforts, including the Quad. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot to be done. And I think that the Biden administration, in many respects, has been waiting for the opportunity to really push forward a multifaceted approach on all those areas.
Okay, great, thank you. Dr. Song.
Oh, yes. I think President Yoon Suk-yeol and President Biden will need to start their discussion probably in May on the foreign policy priority of their own country. Of course, we need to admit that making North Korea issues to become a top priority of Biden administration's foreign policy is mission impossible. We have to admit that. And Washington's focus will remain on Taiwan, relatively neglecting North Korea issues. In that case, some South Koreans will begin to believe that Washington discusses North Korea with Seoul, not because it has deadly serious intention to resolve the problem, but because it simply wants South Korea to remain in the alliance against China. But South Korea is not fully ready to join the US-led big fleets to fight against China. South Korea still worries the situation in which the prioritization of China by the United States may sacrifice the denuclearization policy by the ROK-US alliance. Over the last decade or so, the concern has been the possibility that North Korea may return with renewed nuclear technology and more advanced weapon system if the ROK and US maintain strategic patience. Unfortunately, I think the scenario comes true now. One thing I want to mention about the supply chain is that the United States attempt to, and has been attempting to decouple China in the global supply chain. It also poses imminent burden or threat to the South Korean government and industry as well. Moreover, Buy America campaign and policy of the Biden administration will also put pressure on South Korea's export companies. If the ROK and the United States really want to realize a comprehensive strategic alliance, it is, I think, important for both countries not to make or minimize potentially conflictual issues in the economic front.
Well, today we look into what are the opportunities and challenges for the Yoon administration in dealing with the Korea-US relations. Well, as we discussed today on the global scale, global level, like US-China strategic competition and Russian invasion of Ukraine and supply chain disruption, there are a lot of uncertainties and risks in Yoon's foreign policy environment. And also, as a part of that, perhaps Yoon and Biden may have to think about what will be the best strategy to bilaterally handle those issues and make a best out of the chance about these difficult issues. And also, even though we South Korean people elected Yoon, perhaps his election victory may not be a blank check to do whatever he wants. Perhaps because he already has a lot of restraints in domestic politics, and also because given his inexperience in foreign policy, perhaps he needed to talk with many people with the same idea and different ideas in both streams. So having said that, let's wrap up today's meeting. And before conclude, is there anyone who want to final remarks? Okay, we are exhausted. Scott.
Yeah, I just am going to respond to Professor Song with regards to the issue of supply chain resiliency. And it's true, I think, that the Biden administration has moved in the direction of a technology decoupling with China, and it involves the securitization of technology. And the real challenge from an alliance perspective there is whether or not the United States is able to successfully offer incentives that encourage the integration of some of South Korea's technological advantages into the US supply chain. And if the administration is able to do that successfully, then it will alleviate some of South Korea's fears about its technology being put at risk by America first. If the Biden administration fails on that front, then absolutely those concerns become a source of friction in the alliance.
Well, Scott, your remark reminds me that even though alliance is very important for South Korea, but alliance is not all solution to the problems that we have. So in the coming days, I hope indeed that Yoon and Biden discuss this issue more thoroughly and frankly, and come up with a better strategy to bilaterally handle those challenges. So thank you very much for joining us today in first Sejong webinar series. And I also appreciate the people who are logged on YouTube streaming. And I promise that we will continue this kind of dialogue to better come up with a good national strategy for a Yoon administration. Once again, thank you very much for all of you joining today's webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.